And it's obvious that tradition is, in this regard at least, of the Olivet Discourse, it's scatterbrained. People are not agreeing with each other. And they're all bouncing ideas around, none of which are entirely coherent. And the fundamental reason for the lack of coherence is, I believe, that everyone's assuming that Jesus answers the first question first and the last question last. And Matthew goes out of his way, uniquely, to show that no, Jesus answers the last question first and the first question last. So to the degree that Christians today are concerned about, this novel interpretation of first century fulfillment, the irony is that the novelty is not with myself or Scott McKnight or others who claim this. The novelty is with everyone who's veered away from what Matthew intended literarily.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, a podcast with a long tagline and Bible stuff. Today's guest is Jonathan Sedlak. I'm not going to take a lot of time setting things up. We will jump right into it. I do want to say, though, if you're listening to this for free, please head on over to whatever platform it is that you use, rate, subscribe, review, all of those things so that the algorithm will push us out there to more and more people. I appreciate your downloads and I appreciate your support in any way that you can give it. Another way to keep on top of the podcast is through social media, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Spoutable, Threads, any of those. I try to post clips as soon as I do an interview so that you know who's coming up. And then if you want to, you can head on over to patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeans podcast and chip in $5 a month and receive episodes 12 days early. Other than that, I don't have anything. So yeah, enjoy my conversation with Jonathan Sedlak. I will be back at the end of the episode to set up next week. Jonathan Sedlak, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I was raised in a confessionally reformed tradition. Westminster Confession of Faith, Three Forms of Unity, the broad tradition, confessionally reformed. I was catechized as a teenager. Grew up in an environment studying Puritan theology, systematic theologies, things like that. But that's actually not my current profession. For the last 25 years or so, I've built my professional career in a field that's very different than theology, whether it's systematic, historical, biblical, or what have you. I'm in my mid-40s now, but beginning in my late teenage years, I started a career as an electrician. And so my formal education and certification is as an electrician for projects in industrial, commercial, and residential settings. I also specialize in troubleshooting very old, outdated, complex electrical systems in 100-year-old buildings. Now, as far as my studies leading up to the book that was recently published back in 2024, as far as my studies leading up to that are concerned, in my early 20s, it all started around the age of 20. I had this urge to become a pastor like every young, restless, reformed kid does. And I had a strong passion for the tradition I was raised in at that time, and that passion developed lifelong habits, which stayed to this day, like waking up at 4:30 in the morning every day and reading. It's one of my, I think it's a great habit. Not everybody does it, but I wake up at the crack of dawn and I read, drink coffee, make coffee, and read. So eventually that passion and these habits that I had, projecting to become a pastor, they fizzled away, and I became more interested in things like the history of ideas and the academic side of Christian traditions. One scholar who inspired me to blend my passion of pastoral concern and academic rigor was Peter Leithart, who wrote the foreword to my book. And so an amazing opportunity arose back in 2013 or thereabouts. Ended up being a huge milestone for my life. I spent years as a student of the Theopolis Institute in Birmingham, Alabama, and they were able to accommodate my insanely busy career at that time. And that's how the production of my book came about. Does that satisfy your question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have a rubric here, so it's whatever you want to tell us about yourself. And the book in question is Reading Matthew, Trusting Jesus, Christian Tradition and First Century Fulfillment in Matthew 24 through 25. So it's the Olivet Discourse, and you have a different reading than I, and it sounds like you grew up of the Olivet Discourse. So I guess broad strokes, can we just kind of go over what the Olivet Discourse is and how you're pivoting away from what a lot of the audience may have been exposed to?
Yeah, totally. Well, start with what the Olivet Discourse is. The Olivet Discourse is a collection of teachings given by Jesus, formed into a lengthy speech and recorded in the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptics being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they look the same. They look similar. That's what synoptic means. So the Olivet Discourse is a speech. Interestingly enough, it's conspicuously missing in John's Gospel, but it's a speech. It's a discourse that's not merely a pericope or a passing moment of Jesus's life with insights from him, but rather like a noticeably lengthy section of sayings delivered by him within a specific historical context. And in all the synoptics, there's noticeable literary intent by the authors as to why they're introducing it at that place in each gospel. In Matthew's version, which is the version that I'm overwhelmingly prioritizing for my book, that's why it's called Reading Matthew, Trusting Jesus. In Matthew's version, the Olivet Discourse takes place on the Mount of Olives, overlooking Herod's temple complex in Jerusalem in the first century. And it takes place immediately after Jesus pronounces soon coming destruction of Herod's temple in that generation. In Luke's version, it's actually, I footnote this in the book. In Luke's version, it actually shows Jesus going between the temple. He's teaching in the temple and then lodging at the Mount of Olives at night, and he does this for a short while. And it frames basically all the content of Luke's gospel as a message that is directly connected with the things Jesus is preaching inside the temple complex. But in Matthew, he's having a discussion with his disciples while overlooking the temple that he just promised would be destroyed. And what most Christians today understand Jesus to be communicating in this discourse is a message related to the end of the world, foretelling the signs that precede Christ's bodily return or his second coming at the end or near the end of history. Along with the message, where towards the end it's interpreted as all Christians need to be vigilant, they need to be watchful, that he could return anytime. And that's designed to comfort all believers in him as they trust his promises and as they endure trials and tribulations in this world prior to that end, which hasn't occurred yet in the modern understanding of the discourse.
And where you're pivoting is you're saying these things they are done. They're not anticipated.
I propose a lot of things in my book, but yeah, what I'm proposing is that Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse. This is going to sound controversial, but I'm going to say it knowing that I'm letting everybody know in advance. I am proposing that the Olivet Discourse in Matthew's Gospel describes and teaches absolutely nothing and prophesies absolutely nothing about the end of history, the end of the cosmos, the universe, or the world. Rather, it's entirely about an anticipated end of their world in the first century. The Olivet Discourse is framed as being about the specific questions asked of Jesus, namely, when will these things happen? pointing to the temple, and it's stones that'll be thrown down. And what will be the sign of your, it's usually translated your coming. The Greek word is parousia, and it means just presence. It's another word used in the New Testament by Paul is apousia. It's the absence. This is the presence of Christ. And then there's another part of the question that says what is the sign of the conclusion of that age in which they lived? In other words, in terms of a literary composition, I'm proposing that all three questions asked of Jesus involved soon coming first century events. Every section of Jesus' responses to his disciples, it pertained to soon coming first century events culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in that generation of his disciples. So it's not merely about the temple. It's about everything that made that people at that time. With the temple is an important icon and monument of that culture. But the prophecy of the Olivet Discourse is not just about the temple, but all the events leading up to it in the first century and culminating it, which we now know historically through Josephus, somewhat from a different angle, somewhat through Tacitus, about the wars between Judeans and Rome and the surrounding towns. And it was the most cataclysmic event in the history of that people. And I'm proposing that that's what it's about.
Okay. And so there's the literary element, and this is not, I guess, a literary consideration for this specific passage. You're saying this is a literary consideration that exists, not the claim necessarily itself, but it fits within a literary pattern, I guess, of the Gospel of Matthew overall.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's a much bigger conversation. I suppose that what I would say is that what I do in order to help Christians understand the history of interpreting this chapter, because that's what my book is about. My book is less about me telling you how to interpret every verse. In fact, I don't tell people how to interpret every verse in the Olivet Discourse. It's less about my interpretation of Matthew's gospel and the history of Christian interpretation. And in order to set that up, and I can explain this in probably a better way to explain it is to explain how my book is arranged. But in order to do this, I show that Matthew's gospel has been viewed many ways that are consistent with Second Temple Jewish literature and early Christian literature. And then that helps us appreciate with greater confidence that the Olivet Discourse had more, it makes us aware of greater literary intentionality by the time we get to the discourse. Because it's really easy to look at a gospel 2,000 years separated from it and say, well, why did he write that right there? Like, I would have said more. Or, what does this mean? This is really vague. And then we just rely upon commentaries or church fathers or our local pastor who's, the personality of the parish. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show Christians the whole history of interpreting this discourse. Broadly. I've got a lot of comments, a lot of evidence showing that this is a pretty lengthy and important discussion to have within Christian tradition. And there are ways to view it with modern evidence that help us appreciate it better. The structure, that is. The structure is one of those ways.
And broadly speaking, there's the patristic period, the pre-modern period, and the modern period, right? That's kind of what I picked up. Okay.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Do you mind if I talk about that along with, connecting with what I just said, kind of giving the flow of my book? Would that be helpful?
You're the guest. You're the guest.
So those three periods are really general, right? So I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to parse every single era of thought, but the logic goes like this for my book. My book includes 3 chapters of historical exegesis. One that begins with 4 significant, influential patristic sources around the late 300s and early 400s, and then it ends in the early 1100s. The sources that I'm going through, we can all see their interpretation of the Olivet Discourse. Another chapter covers the early 1200s through the mid 1800s, and then another chapter picks up from that period in the mid 1800s, and it surveys scholars up to the present day and how to understand Matthew's Olivet Discourse. Technically, my study ends with a commentary published in 2017, but it includes notes of commentaries that span all the way up to 2023. My research highlights that the early patristic period, think more like around the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, that the early patristic period in which there are all sorts of eschatological perspectives that are being challenged, and there are scriptural details about eschatology that are being dissected and discussed more frequently than ever before. To the best of my knowledge, that's what I'm noticing. And in particular, by the early 400s, we have dozens of explicit patristic remarks connected with the Olivet Discourse. And that shows a widespread reception of an idea. And that idea is that part of the Olivet Discourse was fulfilled in the first century. I mean, I grew up never hearing this. When I grew up, it was like the Olivet Discourse was all about the end of the world, the cosmos, the universe, Jesus returning on a white horse, the Antichrist, and all this stuff. I never heard first century fulfillment growing up. But when you look at the early patristic sources, there's a clear idea that at least part of the discourse is clearly fulfilled in the first century. And that's the part where Jesus responds to his disciples' first question. The question, when will these things happen? Pointing to the temple. And I present the case in my book that from the dawn of the 5th century forward, patristic sources maintain this idea that the Olivet Discourse begins with prophecy about first century cataclysmic events, but then transitions into futuristic territory about the second coming and other things. They try to map that meaning onto other statements within the New Testament and other extra-biblical literature too. And so after I establish evidence for this, what I do in my book is I stop at the end of the first 1,000 years of Christian interpretation that's influential. And I go back to Matthew's Gospel to see if this patristic reception of the Olivet Discourse matches Matthew's literary intentionality. So, like as the first millennium of Christian thought developed, it became common to understand Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse as though Jesus is asked one question, the first question, about first century events, and then another question, a 2-part question, or 2 questions, however you want to interpret that, about events leading up to the end of our world. But when we look back at Matthew's Gospel and analyze its literary intent with resources and tools at our disposal today, we discover that Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse is the only version that does not comport with this patristic approach. And so after writing a chapter on Matthew, so I pause after the first 1,100 years, I deal with Matthew's Gospel and Matthew's literary intentionality. Just as I'm approaching the patristic sources and their literary intentionality for why they're saying what they're saying. After the chapter on Matthew's literary intentionality, I pick up where I left off at the end of the first millennium, and then I continue showing highly influential interpretations of the discourse up through the mid-1800s. And I describe this era as the pre-modern era because there are huge shifts in schools of thought and trajectories of interpretations after the mid-1800s. Because of factions and rivalries within Christian tradition, most notably between Eastern churches and the Church of Rome, followed by Protestants and their combat with Rome. This pre-modern system of interpretation, it ends up being all over the map, literally and figuratively, especially in their attempts to make sense of the Olivet Discourse. So by walking the reader through this dense history of interpreting one discourse in the New Testament, I showed that there's very little agreement among this narrow area within Christian tradition. by the time we arrive at the mid-1800s, with the exception of only one thing. They are all noticing that tradition contains a futuristic transition of some kind that must take place between Jesus prophesying stuff about first century fulfillment and Jesus prophesying stuff about the end of the world. I think this is fascinating, but like the way most flesh that out across this era is by assuming that Jesus answers his disciples' first question first. To get the first century fulfillment part out of the way so that Jesus can then transition into futuristic stuff and address his disciples' second question about signs and his coming and the end of the world and that kind of stuff. But one significant problem with that assumption, that deeply rooted historical assumption that I trace, is that if you look back at the chapter of Matthew that I map out, Matthew, or whoever composed Matthew's gospel, goes out of his way to show Jesus answering the disciples' last question first, and their first question last. So, that's what my book is really about, is the history of an idea. So by the time I'm finished showing nearly 1,800 years of Christian interpretation, the reader can see where this train of interpretation derailed and why no individual scholar fully agrees with each other for 1,800 years. And that's because by the mid-1800s, very few scholars challenged mainstream assumptions about the Olivet Discourse. In particular, the assumptions about the order in which Jesus answers his disciples' questions. They, with the exception of a few who I do note throughout my book, chapter 3, with the exception of a few, most assume that Jesus is answering the first question first, about first century stuff, and then Jesus transitions into futuristic end of our world stuff. And so they're all aware of a long-standing tradition which says Jesus answers his disciples' questions in the order he's asked, beginning with the first question, which is, to them, in tradition, it's clearly about first century events that culminate in the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 CE. But when the other questions are treated as though they're about the distant future, you get these overlapping ideas about Jesus suddenly returning on clouds, as quick as lightning, on a white horse, or what have you. They blend all kinds of ideas that are not actually contained in Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse. I mean, they're not. I agree with N.T. Wright. They're not in Mark or Luke either. But N.T. Wright and others, they're Pauline scholars. I focus predominantly upon Matthew and its reception. So in other words, I show that though the first 1,800 years of Christian interpretation is viewing the Olivet Discourse through a lens of settled dogma, though they're really just parroting conjecture.
You use the phrase goes out of his way, that the author of Matthew goes out of his way to represent Jesus answering the second question first. How do you mean?
In terms of the...
how would the audience see that in their, an RSV or whatever they're reading?
It might not come, just by the translation of it. What I like to do, I've taught Matthew's Gospel many, many, many times. What I like to do is I like to have people walk through how many questions there are. We have a discussion of that, and usually, the answer is always either Jesus has asked 2 questions or Jesus has asked 3 questions. That's the starting point, is to understand how many questions are being asked and what the center of those questions is. So if I were to ask you, what's the central question of the questions asked? And if you're asked, when will these happen? What will be the sign of your parousia, your coming, your presence, and the sign of the end of the age? Which one's the central one? Even if I don't tell you how many technical grammatical questions there are, what's the central one?
I mean, I don't know. I feel on the spot.
Okay, the central one is the coming of Christ, the parousia of Christ, which everyone associates with other areas of Scripture, other extra canonical literature within their tradition as well. But I begin by pointing out how many questions are asked. And actually, I show that Matthew's gospel is unique, where if you look at the history of commentaries translating Matthew's gospel, Matthew has more questions than Mark and Luke. Mark and Luke has got 2 questions. Matthew's the one who noticeably among commentaries, frequently among commentaries, has this additional question. So it's not only when will these things happen, and will be the sign of your coming, but also this question about the end of the age. My preference is to temporarily sidestep the grammatical fact that there are 2 questions asked. And that's so that I can highlight the practical importance of seeing 3 parts total among the questions asked. And I deal with this in the weeds of my book in footnotes, and I highlight this whenever it comes up among commentaries, that ultimately how many questions are being asked is not as important grammatically, although some scholars insist that it is crucial. I don't think it's crucial. The point is, from a literary structure, you can see that the central question is about the coming of Christ. You can see that prior to that, Jesus is talking about the end, and signs of the end. And you can see after the section that's in the middle of it about Christ coming, you can see after that you got all these statements about time, about the day and the hour. Even the term for time is actually in that section. It's the only section where it appears. Jesus introduces parables about the days of Noah, the foolish virgins who sleep instead of staying awake. And they're late to meet the bridegroom. There's a parable about a wise servant who remains faithful because he trusts his master will come soon at the proper time as promised. That's towards the end of chapter 24. So again, like loosely, if we realize that there are 3 parts to these questions, preceding it is the language about the end. And it's the only area where that language shows up with clear signs about the end. And that's one part of a question. That follows the parousia section that's explicitly about his coming. And then you get all these parables indicate in references to time, which matches the when question. When will these things happen? That's the basic answer to the question you asked of me, is how would readers today see that? Is that helpful? I know that's a long-winded way of explaining how a reader, an English reader especially, can see it. But I actually map it out in the structure. I map it out with the language. I map it out with verses. I map it out conceptually. And then I compare it with everybody else's interpretation throughout history. So I'm confident that there's substance to it. And I hope that explanation is simple enough to encourage people to go and look for themselves and, ask the right questions. What am I missing? I would be surprised. I'd be genuinely surprised with what I've studied to find somebody that can that sees something other than this, because I think it's self-evident if you're paying attention to the details.
Yeah, I asked that. I mean, the phrase stood out to me, goes out of his way, and I was like, I better follow up on this, because I know, as someone with a long commute, if I'm driving and I hear something I bump on, I can't, even if I want to, I can't check that person's book right away. And so I figured this being an approach to the text that, again, most of the audience who are Christian, they roll this into a kind of, foretelling, eschatological prophecy or oracle that's, I guess, about them, right? That they hope is about them and the world that they're in, which is something I was wondering is, are any of the interpreters who start to move away from first century understandings of the the events described, are they self-conscious about the fact that, like, hey, we're so far out from it, it has to be a thing that we're looking forward to rather than something we look back on?
Well, as with any area of historical theology, there are many factors that come into play. There are many reasons why any singular theologian or scholar or person would think a certain way. I'm of the personal conviction that there are traditions outside of the Protestant canon as we have it that are very early and very ancient and continued to be passed on. With the same kind of flaws that come into play with transmitting a manuscript. I'm not saying that it's, perfect or magical or anything, but I think that what's happening by the time you get to the Council of Nicaea and that era where I'm claiming that a noticeable methodology arises in this trajectory of interpreting the Olivet Discourse, splitting it between first century fulfillment and end of our world fulfillment, where that begins and really launches into Christian tradition. I'd say that by the time of the Council of Nicaea, there are other traditions at play. To use, Protestant terms, there are extra biblical traditions at play, but there are organic traditions that are being handed down, and those influence the church fathers. So it's not primarily, I would say it is primarily Scripture that they want to encourage and endorse and foster an understanding of. But we just don't know what those traditions were in particular. And so when they deviate, they're deviating because they don't have libraries at their fingertips. They don't have the media of that generation. Was actually quite incredible, but it was so vastly different than what we're accustomed to. It's actually quite easy to, when looking at it, to be amazed by what they are capable of doing. But when one theologian deviates, he's not trying to explain what sources he's interacting with necessarily, and how he got this information and why he's systematizing it the way that he is. Like one part of my book, which I would love to write more about, but other scholars have already written plenty about it, has to do with just the Eusebian canon tables and the singular influence that plays upon scholars like St. Augustine, when he meshes Gospels together and he relates all these verses together and he appeals to this verse of the New Testament and these among the Gospels. Well, Eusebius created tables that help somebody associate themes across the Gospels, and those end up being printed in an overwhelming amount of manuscript traditions in large cities and monasteries throughout the world in various languages. And that was a kind of media to help people think systematically about the Gospels, think about apparent contradictions, and then talk about them. But they're just talking off the cuff with their own limitations of understanding. So when a scholar goes and starts deviating from what has become a standard interpretation, that becomes noticeable. But really, in my book, I'm showing that there's a clear traceability of influence. It becomes widespread through like catenas, like Thomas Aquinas's Golden Chain. It's a commentary on the Gospels where it shows all these patristic sources and what they said about the Gospels. And there are multiple catenas in the Byzantine tradition, but that's the Latin tradition that's most famous for spreading patristic interpretations of the Gospels with. When you see deviation, it's not as jarring. And my book is really honing in on the fact that we have all this difference of interpreting the Olivet Discourse, and yet they're still all assuming that Jesus is answering the first question first, because that's most clearly a question about first century events, first century cataclysmic events that reach its fulfillment in time in Jerusalem's siege and the temple's destruction. They think that that's just most obvious interpretation. And so the tradition builds, but then they also, by that time, they already have a tradition, and they don't think that they're deviating from it. They think they're reinvigorating. How do we view the rest of the discourse in light of the fact that Jesus is going to come back on a white horse someday? I'm making up the symbolism to intentionally blend it with the Book of Revelation. But you get my point. Theologians and scholars, they overlap all these conceptual ideas from other books. But if you're just focusing on Matthew's gospel, or at the broadest level, the Olivet Discourse among the gospels, you don't get this end of our world teaching. You get a very clear first century teaching, and Matthew's is the most clear. And the Christian tradition, the tradition itself definitely misses this, and that's what makes the beauty of tradition so valuable. That's what makes tradition both beautiful and valuable. Because without this tradition of interpreting it this way and passing it on, we might not actually be able to see so clearly a fundamental misunderstanding of Matthew's gospel. And Matthew's clearly saying, no, whatever Jesus was talking about, it was definitely first century. And the way you know that is here, I'll show you. Jesus starts answering the question about the end of the age first. And you all think it's about Jerusalem. That's because it was about Jerusalem. It was about first century events. And then he moves on to the parousia, which is also about first century events. And then he concludes by answering the question, when will these things happen? Which is also about first century events.
So a couple of things, and you can absolutely reject this analogy if you want. That's I would understand it. But when you talked about, and this was earlier on in the conversation, this was the destruction of their world. We, looking at it from a broader aperture here, farther out in history, we don't see it that way. So it must not be right, because it doesn't include us. But it reminded me of 9/11. I remember, I'm 42. I think we're about the same age. I remember I was 18 years old, and I wasn't even on the ground, and it was a really big deal. And I think we did do a lot of reorganizing and re-understanding things in the years after that to situate it as a discrete moment in history rather than the frightening and terrifying thing that it was when it happened. And you could probably, we were, before we started recording, we were talking about hurricanes, and, I could definitely tell you, being in flooding in Hurricane Harvey, or, just anyone who was there in New Orleans for Katrina, it seems like your world is ending. And so I think it's a perspective thing. I also
just imagine if you have if our world, if New Orleans was not just a religious center, but it was it was a financial sector. It was a storage place for the larger empire's wealth. It was a guaranteed stream of revenue that was important for the well-being and peace of the larger empire around it. And then you have Hurricane Katrina. That would fit. Obviously the difference is that we don't view New Orleans this way. It's an awesome place to go to get great food, right? But the tragedy happens, and our world doesn't end, because now we're thinking cosmologically about the planet we're on. But in the first century, the world was that empire. They just didn't think the way that we do now. Does that make sense? So I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah. I don't know. I want to push back because New Orleans is where the beignets are, but I'll leave it there. No. I think, that's kind of what I'm saying. I am also wondering, of the more recent scholars, so say in the last 20, 25 years, we'll go 50 years, because I'm realizing 25 years is not that long to me anymore. But in the last, say, 50 years, are there commentators who will deal with this history and still arrive at kind of a bifurcated interpretation of these answers?
Is your question about them noticing
Like, do they acknowledge
what
it?
I'm
But
presenting? Or...
yeah. They'll acknowledge that, like, hey, this was all wrapped up as, understood as answered within the first century at one point. But I am rejecting that because, or
Yes.
if they don't, okay, I'll stop.
The closest example of that in particular that I can recall is not in a commentary per se, but in a monograph. I think it was by G.K. Beale. Like, I want to say it's like Jesus in the Future. I have it in blue hardcover in my library. I don't know. I can't think of it. I cited in one of the footnotes at the end of my book that a couple points of his that I actually agree with. But he has this concluding argument of his book that, most naturally when you read this discourse, it's clearly dealing with, it could clearly be interpreted as entirely in the first century. But we know that Jesus didn't return bodily in the first century, so therefore we are required to use our intelligence and conclude that must be future, and there must be some explanation as to why that part of the discourse has not yet been fulfilled. Now, that style of argument, but not necessarily in that specific way, comes up in many commentaries, especially in commentaries that begin in the 1980s and onward. But by then you already have, you're not in the pre-modern era, you're in a different era where we've got all kinds of how do I say this? I don't want to say crazy, but like cool, novel, creative, difficult, disciplined rival interpretations to the pre-modern systems. And there's all this engagement. And in the midst of it, the more people dig up evidence in modern commentaries, they are definitely more comfortable saying, yeah, this definitely begins entirely discussing first century events, and it promises fulfillment in first century events. But we need to move on because we know that Christian tradition is very clear, and we can't deviate from the tradition. And the tradition says that the rest of this is about the end of the world. So that's more or less the approach that scholars take. I was actually really refreshed to find this year Scott McKnight produced a little paperback on Matthew's Gospel, like a pastoral commentary on Matthew's Gospel. I forget the name of it.
I'll look it up. It's not a big deal.
Okay. And it's going to bug me, though, if I don't.
Keep talking. I'll look for it.
One T, S-C-O-T, McKnight. It's usually why it doesn't come up in search engines. And in that, he gets to the Olivet Discourse, and he explains really candidly. He says, I've looked at a ton of literature on this. I think it's all wrong. This is all dealing with first century events, and I'm sticking to my guns because this makes the most sense of the discourse. And I'm like, whoa. Finally, somebody says what I think is equally obvious. We don't have to dance around the meaning of this discourse. It's all talking about first century events. And that there are principles that apply, that reverberate throughout just being a human being in this world and living in eras that have political and economic and social turmoil, especially ones that centered around religious ideologies, like the Herod's Temple in Jerusalem or something like that. So there's application, but Scott McKnight says, just real candidly, I'm going to be interpreting it this way, this discourse this way, because I no longer agree with my previous positions. I think this is all dealing with first century stuff, and I think that's a win. He didn't even have to read my book, and he figured it out. That's how awesome Scott McKnight can be.
Although I'm sure you'd appreciate it if you picked it up, right?
Yeah. So Scott, if you're listening, I have your book. I love it.
Scott, thanks for listening. If you're listening. So I think it's Matthew living every day as Jesus taught us.
Yeah, and it just recently came out, like this year or something.
Yeah.
It's not old.
It was February of 2025.
Yeah, I nerd out on monographs and commentaries in Matthew's Gospel. It's the only reason why I even know that. I just nerd out. I have so many commentaries and so many monographs in Matthew's Gospel. I can't even honestly say that I've read every page of all of them, but I know what I'm looking for when I have them, and I'm up to date on what new scholars are presenting. And it's not any different in terms of what the book I wrote. I feel like what I wrote in my book is it will remain a challenge unless more people like Scott McKnight, Peter Leithart, and others, with more people realize that there are real credible scholars out there that are saying the same thing, but like we almost feel like we're not allowed to say this. What's obvious, and it's obvious that tradition is, in this regard at least, of the Olivet Discourse, it's scatterbrained. People are not agreeing with each other, and they're all coming up. They're all bouncing ideas around, none of which are entirely coherent. And the fundamental reason for the lack of coherence is, I believe, that everyone's assuming that Jesus answers the first question first and the last question last. And Matthew goes out of his way, uniquely, to show that no, Jesus answers the last question first and the first question last. So to the degree that Christians today are concerned about, this novel interpretation of first century fulfillment, the irony is that the novelty is not with myself or Scott McKnight or others who claim this. The novelty is with everyone who's veered away from what Matthew intended literarily. Because he's the one who presents the evidence we're supposed to be interpreting correctly. The novelty isn't with me. I'm trying to interpret it correctly. And the great thing about my book, again, and this is one thing that I enjoyed while writing it, I wanted everyone to not know how I interpret every verse of the Olivet Discourse. I want the general public to know that my personal interpretations of how does this all fit in the first century? What does this verse mean? How are we supposed to interpret that? I don't care to divulge that, and I don't think the world really cares about my opinion about that. But everyone can see 1,700 plus years of answering that question. How does this verse fit? How does that verse fit? And they can see for themselves that the dissonance can be attributed to a couple misunderstandings. One of them, the most important one, is presumptions about the way in which the order in which Jesus responds to the questions.
So on that note, is there a literary or rhetorical reason to say, yes, absolutely, it would fit within these ancient literary or rhetorical traditions that Jesus would go last verse, first last in his answer?
There could be allusions to last verse, first last with statements of Jesus. I would not pair it with that. There may have been common oral traditions about how to view it, but in terms of literary evidence, I am operating with literary structures that are grammatically justifiable, not just thematically justifiable, to show that this is the way that scribal culture would organize documents that are intended to be read. And I dabble a little bit in my book, mostly through footnotes, showing that there are other gospels, there are other writings that were meant for communal reading rooms. They were meant for an oral culture, like Mark's gospel would have been one of those. I don't believe that Matthew's would have been. I think Matthew's was actually made for scribes, and it was made for studying, and it was one of those expensive books. It was not one that was meant to leave the local community reading room, the local synagogue, the local anything. It was not meant to leave it. It was protected and preserved and used and closely examined by everyone who had a version of it. Another scribe in another community copying it and having it. It's by far the most cited of the synoptics early on. It's definitely the most common found, and that's why it's the most influential. Scholars in the modern era can pontificate about everything being based upon Matthew or some Q source, or some Ur Marcus, all these different theories, which have actually a lot of interesting ideas in them. My personal opinion is we shouldn't throw all that stuff out. We should try to understand it. But like even if we try to operate with those modern systems, it doesn't really affect the artifact that ends up in the local communities and what they study. I personally happen to believe that Matthew's gospel is either very early or late. And so I argue in my book that what the final product of what we have does not depend upon whether Matthew was written first, second, or third. Theoretically, he could have lived after the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. He could have been part of one of these early Judeo-Christian communities that scholars imagine occurred. And he's writing about his Sitzenleben, his situation in life. But my point is that, and I deal with this in my book, when I interact with that material in the modern era of interpretation, I show that, whoever's putting Matthew's gospel together, his literary point is still the same. He is even if we assume that he's long after the events of destruction of Jerusalem. The author of Matthew's gospel is writing a story where Jesus was only talking about first century events that came to fulfillment. We ought not to conclude, as modern scholars frequently do, that if Matthew's writing after the destruction of Jerusalem, well, therefore the first half is clearly about the first century events, but the second half transitions into our future. That's not reasonable in my estimation. I show that from a literary perspective of the first century, what Matthew is doing is well within the bounds of scribal culture, especially Judean scribal culture. That is a hard fact. And that's where I stand. I think that much of the misreading or the overlooking of these structures and these literary ideas comes from generations that are distant from that culture. It's not wrong or right. It doesn't make their interpretation later on less valuable or interesting, but it just shows that there is a disconnect. Greco-Roman cultures did the same kind of literary structuring. Breck wrote a book about that. He wrote a couple books about it. I think it's called Chiasmus in the New Testament. John Breck, an Eastern Orthodox scholar. Then there's also other books that deal with the composition of larger portions of the Tanakh. I forget the name of that, but it's called the literary structure of the Old Testament. There are just hundreds of resources on scribal cultures and organizing stories passed down in a way that puts them in digestible chunks and serves you a meal. And I think Matthew's gospel is doing that. I think Matthew is composing real authentic traditions in a way that he really thought was useful and clear. And I think that's worth revisiting in the modern world, because we've walked very far away from that in Christian tradition. Because now we imagine, now we go back and forth with dispensationalist communities, and they're trying to make absolutely everything about this discourse in the future, and they dumb I'm not trying to be insulting, but in my opinion, they dumb everything down, and they force everything through an artificial system that, we might find some loose ideas about the millennium in the early church, maybe in the earliest church, like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and Papias and stuff, but they're forcing it, they're creating something very new in the modern world and forcing it through an early patristic idea. But what I'm saying is, go before the church fathers. Matthew's culture, Second Temple Jewish culture, early Judeo-Christian culture, has Matthew fitting it, not these modern ideas about the end of the world. That would have been bonkers to them. I truly believe that modern interpretations of eschatology would have been laughed at if one was living in Second Temple Jewish communities. I think they would have found that completely crazy.
I don't think that there would have been much in the culture for them to attach themselves to. I think particularly dispensationalism, having grown up a dispensationalist, I can say it's reliant on a mass market culture that, I mean, even when it first emerged, like mass market was so much more accessible than information in general would have been for the first several hundred years, well, over 1,000 years of Christian history, to where there's nothing to attach it to in the culture. You know, you don't get information with the level of immediacy that someone even in the 70s, like Hal Lindsey, had, where he could keep, you know, digesting and reinterpreting, and then the idea of writing novels with the specificity that the Left Behind novels and then movies had. It's so.
Did you lose it all at Harold Camping? Is that when you quit?
Oh, I don't. I don't.
No.
It's weird. There was a book by, I don't know if he still has this title, but he had a radio show called The Bible Answer Man. This guy, Hank Hanegraaff.
Yeah, the Eastern Orth. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and he did end up converting. I haven't followed him in a long time, but he had a book called Resurrection, and he's talking about resurrection, and that was the point where I was just like, I don't know that any of these passages I've been taught to read as promising a rapture are like, that was the first piece that fell for me. Was it's a very you can't pick out a piece of 1 Corinthians 15 which is about resurrection, and he's not taking a break from that to talk about a discrete event like the rapture. Anyway, that's a digression.
You noticed that, huh? Yeah.
What's that?
So you noticed that, yeah.
Yeah, and that was helpful. That was that was one of the few helpful things that Hank Hanegraaff provided for me, and I'm interested to see how the AI transcribes his name, because it will definitely be wrong. AI is dumb. Transcribe that. Sorry, I lost my.
I don't use it. I don't even know much about it.
Well, no, I mean any of the editing software that I use will just automatically transcribe files when I put them in, and it does make it easier to edit, because I can I can delete text and it'll cut the audio out, and I don't. Other than that, I don't know what I'm doing.
It's a time saver. It's a time saver.
It is a time saver, and it's really the extent of what I think AI is useful for. Unless you want to make.
People are telling me that AI is dumb, and
I think it is.
It's not my.
I think it is, and I'm on record here.
Guy. I'm a low tech guy. I'm a very low tech guy.
I'm as analog as I can be.
Hey.
So, but so you have thrown some recommendations out there, but as we're at about an hour here, I want to make sure I get recommendations on things, and anything that you mentioned, I'll do my best to hunt down, even if you couldn't remember the title specifically. So where would you direct people to get a good understanding, in addition to your book, of what you're talking about here with the Olivet Discourse?
Are you asking a question specifically about the reception history of the Olivet Discourse? Because I could list some of those, and then there are lots of other things that have influenced my mind heavily that I would recommend, that are tangential.
I would say go off. Take it in whatever directions you want.
If we're dealing with the reception history of the Olivet Discourse specifically is very limited. There are not many books that deal with that with great specificity. A general one that the public can get, in fact there are two, are by Ian Boxall. One is called Matthew Through the Centuries. Wiley Blackwell published it. Discovering Matthew is another one that has a little, it's not so much the reception, but it's broadly speaking about the reception of Matthew's Gospel. It's like a smaller version of his Matthew Through the Centuries. That one's published by Eerdmans. And Matthew Through the Centuries is Blackwell. Discovering Matthew is Eerdmans. And he's trying to accomplish two different things. Those are both very accessible books. I mean, if you wanted to spend a fortune, you can get Ulrich Luzz's Hermania series on Matthew's Gospel. There's a Betts guy who does the Sermon on the Mount version. It's actually a huge volume. We're talking thousands of pages. But that one has a very interesting... I strongly disagree with some of Luzz's angles of how to interpret the reception history. I think he assumes his own things and projects them on the reception and the history of reception. But it's still like one of those invaluable resources for a scholar. So Ulrich Luz. Again, like these are all like the rest of these that I could probably say would be academic. Oh, I mean, Thomas Aquinas, John Henry Newman translated his Catena Aurea, and that you can buy anywhere cheaply. There's I have like a library hardcover edition that's really beautiful. But anybody could go through that and could go through the Gospels and see patristic quotes that were harvested by Thomas Aquinas. And it's a legacy of many different ways to interpret the same text throughout the Gospels. In terms of, again, more academic monographs, one that I absolutely love and I cherish in my library, I don't have any idea if this is even available at all. I'm the kind of guy that would say that you can find it on Amazon, buy it, unless it's one of those, that's selling for like $1,300 because it's the only copy in the world. But Alan McNichol wrote this monograph for Mercer University called Jesus's Directions for the Future. And it's a combination of Pauline and Synoptic Gospel reception history about, the end of the world and so on and so forth. Excellent book. Highly recommend it. The same university press also published, this is famous, this series, this 3-volume series is published by many commentaries. I don't know how to pronounce the guy's name, but Edouard Massot is how I would pronounce it. It's called The Influence of the Gospel of Matthew on Christian Literature up to the time of Irenaeus. Something like that. I don't have the name of it before me. So that's a catalog. That's less commentary, but really just showing how accessible Matthew's gospel was to early sources. There are books outside of the scholarly world that I would recommend, like with their research projects that in some ways they're doing original things like I am. Original research or research that challenges well-established assumptions, and in some cases dogmas that don't really need to be dogmas. The first one that comes to my mind that I wish I could have used more throughout my book, but I cited it early on in the introduction, and I moved forward with it as an operating principle. Christian tradition broadly uses this seemingly pejorative term for Jews. They're not really. It only in a lot of instances it appears pejorative because of the connotations and denotations in our modern era, post-Holocaust, which are totally legitimate. But like it becomes anachronistic at a certain point. So Jason Staples published his doctoral dissertation on the idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, and that book is so good to understand how terms like Judeans, Jews, Hebrew, Israel are understood in this world of thought, and not in a nebulous way, a very concrete, historical, factual way. And our modern ideas of what Israel is, are not at all what the Second Temple Jewish tradition was. It's not what they were communicating at all. It's actually much clearer with Jason Staples' research presented before us. Books on typology influenced me. In fact, an obvious name to propose who's influenced me is Peter Leithart. Delivered from the Elements of the World is one of my favorite books I've ever read. That's bigger New Testament picture of what's going on in the first century. He wrote a 2-volume commentary on Matthew's Gospel, like Matthew Through New Eyes. That's accessible. But there's also this other book that I remember reading. I mean, it's got to be 20 years ago or more. Tiny little paperback booklet, and I remember it was just so practical. It was it's published by the same publisher who printed my book, Athanasius Press. It's called, I think it's called Hear, O My Son, and it's the typology of the fatherhood of Yahweh in Deuteronomy. And like what that book showed me was like, wait a minute. Israel is God's son? Like what? And that helped me out. So a long time ago, and it's always stuck with me. So there are little books like that are accessible to lay people that I would frequently recommend. But I also recommend like these other monographs. I could go on and on and on. I did write my book, though. I wrote my book to be as accessible as possible for an audience that can't find a book quite like mine. So anyone that's listening to this, if any part of this has really intrigued them, whether it's an understanding Matthew's gospel or Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse and its literary intentionality, or the history of interpreting that outside of my own, personal beliefs, my book is a one-stop shop to make sense of that. And it's also functions like a launch pad. I do not cover everything that can be covered. I hope that my research encourages other scholars and lay people to think carefully about Christian tradition, to think carefully about what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, and try to veer away from all the excesses that really have piled up in Christian tradition. My book, I think, brings a lot of common sense to Matthew's gospel, to Jesus' teachings, and I hope that helps Christians and scholars read the New Testament and literature around the New Testament in a healthier light, in a less hysterical light, in a more concrete, boots on the ground kind of light. Because if there's anything that I walked away reading Matthew's gospel, studying it for more than 15 years, is there's integrity to this as an archaeological artifact. This is real literature from a real time with a real message that the author really wanted to convey, I think it changes so much if we look at it from that first century, the early Christian perspective. Is that helpful? I didn't give you. I could go on about resources, but that's what.
If you want to, you can.
Let me go down to my library. No.
What do you read for fun?
This is what I read for fun. That might sound totally crazy.
Yeah.
I would say that on the fun side of what I research in relation to all this, the fun side are apocalyptic traditions. I like Tom Holland's Millennium, or his Pax. He has a book called, is it Pax Romana? He wrote it a few years ago. That's a great book about the first century wars between Rome and how to understand the empire and the end of that world, because that's what that book is about.
I really enjoyed Rubicon.
I've not read it. You love it?
The way it's written, yeah. Obviously there's no dialogue, but it reads like a novel. It's such a breezy read. And I'm not a good reader. I'm just easily distracted and I read slowly, but that one moves pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, when you walk away with a dense book and enjoying it, that's great. You could actually make it through the whole thing. Yeah. That's always awesome.
Well, what do you do to decompress then?
This is going to sound crazy. This is what I do to decompress. I shouldn't say that entirely. I spend very early mornings routinely studying, reading, and reading things that I just find enjoyable because it's not what I do for a living. And I do my day job, and then I come home with my family. And on weekends, I guess I decompress by doing more reading, but also I worship in different Christian communities, and I help at local food pantries and support local think tanks. I help my local neighborhood in very practical, humane ways. I don't really. It's kind of funny. If you're asking me a question about decompressing, my answer is, this is what I do. I read these books. The other stuff I do out of love because just of my vision for what the where I am in life and what neighbors need. But I decompress by nerding out on books. I read and I read and I read to a fault. I don't like watching TV. So.
That's fair. You don't have to. You're not in trouble. You're not on the hook to do any particular thing. What's a local food bank to you that I can link in the show notes?
The Kinship Community Food Center.
Okay.
The Kinship Community Food Center. It's the most incredible. It's the most incredible community that exists in the Upper Midwest, and I don't mean that hyperbolically. It really is. You have to be there to experience the pulse. It's just, there's nothing like it. They're helping actually build community in ways that just feel rooted in historic, humane living. Because like I live in a huge city. I live in a neighborhood of 16,000 people, surrounded by a neighborhood of 14,000 people and 34,000 people on the other side. Like I live in a neighborhood like that. I'm surrounded by people, and in the modern age, people are more they're connected more virtually than they are person to person. And what the Kinship Community Food Center does is it uses food, among other things, as the common ground between all classes, all races, all backgrounds, all life experiences. And it's the place where we can all get together and learn of each other, to be changed by others, to help bring about change in others, to be good. It's come up here. Leave your hot, southern, humid climate and come up to Milwaukee during the summer. You don't even need air conditioning up here. Come on up here. You can stay at our place and experience the Kinship Community Food Center.
We don't need to talk about that. You don't need to rub it in. Okay. No, I'll be leaving the Gulf area of the country as quickly as I can. So, well, I'll have a link to that, and so if there's any donations that the audience can throw their way, I know that would be appreciated, and it sounds like it would go to good use. Jonathan Sedlak, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Well, I appreciate you having me on here. I appreciate the opportunity. Hopefully we can connect another time.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
See ya.
Okay. So that is the end of the interview. You are so close to the finish line. There's just one thing left to do, and that is to hear a preview of my conversation with Edward Smither. So that will be out next week, and we will be discussing his chapter from the book, Reading Revelation Missiologically, and his chapter focuses on hospitality. So hospitality in a future sense as the end and means of mission. I think the whole project of approaching Revelation missiologically is very interesting. So we get into the terminology and everything in the actual episode. Yeah. If you're listening for free, you can hear this episode now for $5 a month at patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeans podcast. Yeah. That's all I have. So if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it.
Well, I define mission as crossing boundaries between the people of God and the not yet people of God. And we do this among all peoples, among all nations. And so it's a simple, I've been inspired by the definition by the South African missiologist and theologian David Bosch. But for me, that also makes mission applicable to in my neighborhood, in my city. It's not just, I go over there to do something. And so I work with that rather elastic definition. What we decided to do at Ebenezer Urga at a conference we were together a couple of months ago, he gave his definitions like a whole page, a lot more detailed. Mine's pretty minimalist. But as far as when we think about biblical mission and a biblical theology of mission, what we didn't want to do was come to each author and say, okay, you need to work within this definition. But we always let Scripture lead us to theology and to our definitions. And so there's a lot of latitude I don't think any of the authors would disagree with the definition that I've given, but they would express it a bit differently. And so one of the authors to the Reading James missiologically, he just said, I'm just letting the scripture speak to this question of what is the mission of God. And I think that's a good method. And so it's gonna, and when you think about our different authors who've contributed, I think in Reading Revelation, it was 14 chapters. And we have people, I think, from 8 different nationalities. We have people from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, from the West. And so, it doesn't seem to be wise to have a global conversation about scripture and mission and to tell people you need to work under this definition.